When you study World War II, when you examine why the Allies ultimately defeated the Axis powers, the conventional narrative focuses on certain dramatic events: the Battle of Stalingrad, the D-Day invasion, the strategic bombing campaigns. These battles are well documented. They're dramatic. They're the moments where history seems to turn on a knife's edge. But there's another story running underneath these dramatic battles, a story that's less visible but ultimately more consequential, a story about logistics, about supply lines, about how armies actually move and fight and sustain themselves. This is the story of why American industrial philosophy proved superior to German industrial philosophy, and why that difference mattered more than many people realize. To understand this story, you have to understand a fundamental difference in how the American military and the German military approached the problem of moving supplies and equipment across enormous distances in wartime. Let's start with a specific example. The GMC CCKW truck. This was an American-designed and produced military truck. It's commonly called the Deuce-and-a-Half because of its 2.5-ton cargo capacity. Over 562,000 of these trucks were produced between 1941 and 1945 by GMC and other manufacturers, making it one of the most produced military vehicles in history. The GMC CCKW had specific technical characteristics. The GMC 270 engine produced 104 horsepower. It had a 5-speed manual transmission with a 2-speed transfer case. It featured a 6-6 drive configuration, meaning power went to all 6 wheels. It had a maximum payload of 5,000 pounds. It could be driven by men with minimal training. It could be maintained by soldiers with basic mechanical knowledge using standardized tools. Now contrast this with the German equivalent. The Opel Blitz was Germany's primary logistics truck during the war. It was a capable vehicle. It was well engineered. It had excellent components, but there were critical differences. The Opel Blitz came in multiple configurations. The most common version was a 4-door-2 rear-wheel drive truck. This meant power only went to the rear wheels. In muddy conditions, on rough terrain, this was a significant limitation. The GMC, with its 6-6 drive, could power through conditions that would immobilize the Opel. Production numbers tell the story. Germany produced approximately 100,000 Opel Blitz trucks during the entire war. That sounds like a large number, but it's less than 1/5 the production of the GMC CCKW alone. And the GMC was just one model. America also produced Dodge trucks, Studebaker trucks, International Harvester trucks, and many others. Total American truck production during the war exceeded 2.5 million vehicles. The difference wasn't primarily one of engineering quality. It was one of manufacturing philosophy. Germany approached truck design like they approached much of their military equipment. They designed for precision. They designed for performance. They designed for engineering elegance. But they didn't design for mass production at scale. The GMC was different. It was designed from the start to be mass-produced. The body panels were stamped steel, crude but producible in massive quantities. The frame was simple channel steel welded together. The components were standardized. The entire design philosophy prioritized manufacturability over technical perfection. This distinction matters more than most people realize. It's not that American engineers were less capable than German engineers. It's that they understood something fundamental about industrial warfare. In modern warfare, you don't need the best equipment. You need enough equipment. Let me talk about what happened to logistical operations because of these different philosophies. In 1944, after the D-Day invasion, the Allies faced a logistical challenge that had never been attempted before. They had established a beachhead in Normandy. They needed to supply millions of soldiers with food, ammunition, fuel, and equipment. They needed to move this material from ports in England and Normandy into France and towards Germany. They needed to do this across a devastated landscape where roads had been destroyed, bridges had been demolished, and German forces were still actively resisting. The solution was the Red Ball Express. This was an all-truck supply route that operated from August 1944 through November 1944. It was the largest logistics operation in military history up to that point. At its peak, the Red Ball Express involved approximately 6,000 trucks operating continuously, moving supplies from ports to the combat zones. The vast majority of these trucks were American-produced models: GMC CCKW trucks, Dodge trucks, Studebaker trucks, International Harvester trucks, all designed and produced using American mass production principles, all built with standardized parts, all maintainable by soldiers with basic mechanical skills. This wasn't possible with German trucks. German military logistics, by contrast, relied heavily on horses. Approximately 80% of German supply movements used horse-drawn wagons. The Wehrmacht had millions of horses. These horses required fodder, water, and rest. They could move perhaps 30 kilometers per day in good conditions. They couldn't operate in winter effectively. Thousands froze to death in the Russian winters. This wasn't necessarily because Germany didn't have the capacity to build trucks. It was because Germany's approach to truck design and production meant they couldn't produce trucks in the quantities needed to replace horses. The complexity of German truck designs meant they required more skilled labor, more sophisticated manufacturing equipment, more specialized components. American manufacturers, by contrast, could produce vehicles that any trained factory worker could manufacture. They could produce them in quantities that vastly exceeded what Germany could achieve. They designed for their strength, which was mass production. Let me talk about the specific characteristics that made American trucks suitable for mass production and German trucks less suitable. The GMC CCKW used a standardized parts strategy. Bolts, nuts, wrenches, everything was sized to fit standard tools. This meant that mechanics didn't need specialty equipment to maintain the trucks. A soldier with a basic set of wrenches could maintain the vehicle in the field. The engine was accessible. Components were positioned where they could be serviced without removing major parts of the vehicle. Oil filters could be changed without tools. Spark plugs were easy to access. The entire maintenance philosophy was designed around the assumption that mechanics would be field-based, working in difficult conditions with limited equipment. German trucks were engineered differently. The Opel Blitz, despite being an excellent vehicle, required factory conditions for major maintenance. Sophisticated suspension systems required specialized tools. The design prioritized performance and refinement over field maintainability. The transmission in the GMC was a commercial design, only slightly modified for military use. The engine was based on a commercial truck engine. Most of the components were commercial or minimal modifications of commercial products. This meant that the GMC could be produced using existing manufacturing capacity. Civilian truck plants could produce GMC trucks for military use without massive retooling. German trucks, by contrast, required specialized manufacturing. German automotive factories had to completely retool for military truck production. They couldn't use existing capacity as effectively. The result was that production capacity was limited. Let me provide some specific production numbers to illustrate this difference. In 1943, the United States produced approximately 400,000 military trucks of all types. This wasn't just GMC CCKW. This included Dodge trucks, Studebaker trucks, International Harvester trucks, and other models, all designed according to American mass production principles. In the same year, Germany produced approximately 30,000 military trucks of all types. That's a difference of more than 10 to 1. Over the course of the entire war, American truck production exceeded 2.5 million vehicles. German truck production was less than 300,000. This wasn't because American factories were staffed by more numerous workers. It was because American factories used mass production, techniques that allowed them to produce vastly more vehicles per worker. American assembly lines used techniques developed over decades of civilian automobile production, interchangeable parts, assembly line manufacturing, production scheduling optimized for throughput rather than individual quality. The goal was to produce as many vehicles as possible as quickly as possible. German manufacturing was still operating according to older principles. Each vehicle received more individual attention. Quality was higher on a per-unit basis, but production volume was lower. The irony is that both approaches had merit depending on context. In peacetime, German manufacturing would produce superior vehicles. A Opel Blitz might last longer, require fewer repairs, and provide better performance than a GMC CCKW. But in wartime, the context is completely different. In wartime, you don't need vehicles that last 20 years. You need vehicles that last long enough to win the war. You don't need vehicles that perform perfectly. You need vehicles that work well enough in the conditions you encounter. And most importantly, you need enough vehicles to sustain your operations. The GMC CCKW was a masterpiece of wartime logistics thinking. It wasn't the best truck ever made, but it was adequate for its purpose and could be produced in quantities that no other truck could match. Let me talk about what this meant operationally. An American division consisted of approximately 15,000 soldiers. To equip and supply that division with all the food, ammunition, fuel, and equipment needed to conduct sustained combat operations required enormous logistical support. American divisions used approximately 2,000 trucks to sustain their operations. By D-Day, the Allies had approximately 40 divisions in the European theater. That's 80,000 trucks supporting combat operations. Beyond these divisional trucks, there were additional trucks in supply services, in rear areas, in depot operations. The German Army, by contrast, used horses for the vast majority of their supply operations. A German division required approximately 5,000 horses to move supplies. Those horses needed fodder. In winter, they froze. Many were lost to cold, hunger, and disease. The American system was incomparably more efficient. Trucks could move supplies hundreds of kilometers per day. Horses could move perhaps 30 kilometers per day. Trucks didn't need rest. Horses did. Trucks could operate in winter. Horses struggled. This efficiency advantage compounded over time. American forces could sustain operations at greater distances from their supply bases. They could maintain higher supply levels. They could replace worn-out equipment more quickly. They could sustain higher operational tempos. This isn't just about logistics. This is about military capability. An army that can sustain supply lines over longer distances can conduct more aggressive operations. An army that can replace worn-out equipment can maintain higher combat effectiveness. An army that can sustain higher operational tempos can maintain pressure on the enemy. The German army, constrained by horses and limited truck production, couldn't match this. They had to conduct operations closer to their supply bases. They had to rebuild supply lines more slowly. They couldn't sustain the same operational tempo. This manifested in specific strategic limitations. After the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, the German army was unable to conduct significant offensive operations, not primarily because they lacked combat units, but because they lacked the supply infrastructure to sustain those operations at scale. They didn't have enough trucks. They didn't have enough horses that hadn't been consumed trying to survive winter. The American Army, by contrast, maintained overwhelming logistical advantage. The Red Ball Express, at its peak, moved 12,000 tons of supplies per day. By 1945, when the Allies launched their final offensive into Germany, logistical capacity wasn't the constraint. The constraint was the combat capacity of the divisions themselves. Let me talk about the specific manufacturing techniques that enabled American truck production at such massive scales. American automobile manufacturers had decades of experience with mass production. Henry Ford had pioneered assembly line manufacturing in the early 1900s. By World War II, American factories had perfected techniques for producing automobiles at scale. These techniques involved several key principles. First, standardization. Components were standardized so that parts from different suppliers were interchangeable. This meant that a factory could source components from multiple suppliers, reducing dependence on any single manufacturer. Second, simplification. Designs were simplified to reduce the number of parts and steps required to manufacture each vehicle. This increased throughput and reduced the possibility of manufacturing defects. Third, interchangeability. Parts were designed so that they could be used in multiple applications. This reduced the number of different parts that needed to be produced and inventoried. Fourth, assembly line efficiency. Manufacturing was organized as a series of assembly stations. Each station performed specific tasks. Products moved down the line, gradually being assembled into finished vehicles. These principles had been developed over decades of civilian manufacturing. During World War II, American factories simply scaled up production and applied these techniques to military vehicles. German manufacturing had evolved differently. German factories emphasized precision and quality. Each vehicle received more individual attention. Components were often custom-fitted. This produced excellent vehicles, but it couldn't be scaled to match American production volumes. When the war started, German factories were organized for peacetime automotive production. They had to be retooled for military production. This required massive capital investment, but it also meant that they couldn't leverage existing manufacturing capacity as effectively as American factories could. American civilian truck manufacturers simply shifted production to military specifications. The basic techniques remained the same. The same assembly line methods that had been producing Dodge civilian trucks could produce Dodge military trucks. The same GMC plants that had been producing commercial vehicles could shift to military production. This flexibility was a massive advantage. By the time Germany fully mobilized for war, America had already shifted to wartime production and was producing vehicles at scales Germany couldn't match. Let me talk about what this meant for overall war production. Germany's approach to manufacturing emphasized quality and engineering refinement. This produced excellent products, but it meant that total production volumes were limited. Every resource devoted to producing one vehicle meant resources weren't available for producing other vehicles. America's approach emphasized quantity and producibility. Every effort was made to maximize the number of vehicles produced. This sometimes meant accepting lower quality or fewer features than German vehicles had, but it meant vastly greater total production. Over the course of the war, this difference compounded. Germany produced fewer vehicles each year. As the war progressed and bombing increased, German production decreased further. American production increased. By 1943 and 1944, American factories were producing multiples of what German factories could produce. This had implications far beyond trucks. The same philosophy applied to tanks, aircraft, small arms, artillery, ammunition, everything. American factories produced in quantities that were simply unobtainable by German manufacturing. Germany produced approximately 1,400 Tiger I tanks during the entire war. Excellent tanks, superior to most American tanks in armor and firepower, but only 1,400 total. The Americans produced over 48,000 M4 Sherman tanks. Sherman tanks were often inferior in direct combat to Tiger tanks, but there were so many of them that they overwhelmed through quantity. This is an uncomfortable truth for those who appreciate engineering excellence. Quantity has a quality all its own. You can have the best tank in the world, but if you only have 1/400 of them and your enemy has 48,000, you lose. Let me talk about how this affected specific operations. The Eastern Front demonstrates this dynamic clearly. Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 with the goal of achieving victory quickly. They assumed they could defeat the Soviets before American industrial capacity could be fully mobilized. This assumption proved incorrect. American industrial capacity was mobilized not just to produce American military equipment, but to produce equipment for the Soviet Union as well. American trucks were shipped to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. American planes were shipped. American ammunition was shipped. A significant portion of American production was devoted to supporting Soviet operations. Soviet factories, meanwhile, were producing their own equipment in massive quantities. Soviet factories produced tanks in enormous numbers. Soviet factories produced aircraft and trucks and artillery. Germany found itself in a war against two opponents with manufacturing capacity that vastly exceeded its own. Germany couldn't outproduce them. Germany could only hope to win through speed and tactical superiority. But that strategy required winning quickly before American and Soviet industrial capacity could be fully mobilized and deployed. Germany didn't win quickly. As the war dragged on, the industrial balance became increasingly unfavorable to Germany. More American equipment arrived, more Soviet equipment arrived. German production couldn't keep pace. Eventually, Germany was overwhelmed. Let me talk about what happened after the war. What lessons did people draw from this experience? German engineers and manufacturers recognized what had happened. The German approach to manufacturing had proven inadequate for industrial warfare. They had produced excellent equipment, but not enough of it, and in war, quantity matters. After the war, German manufacturers began adopting American manufacturing principles. They maintained their emphasis on precision and quality, but they integrated American mass production techniques. Standardization, simplification, assembly line efficiency. This synthesis produced the post-war German automotive industry. German cars maintained their reputation for quality, but they were also produced in much larger quantities using mass production techniques. Modern German vehicles combine German precision engineering with American manufacturing efficiency. The result has been one of the most successful automotive industries in the world. But this is an historical consequence. During World War II, Germany hadn't yet learned this lesson. They were trying to conduct industrial warfare using manufacturing principles, developed for peacetime production. Let me talk about what this means for understanding. World War II, the conventional narrative focuses on battles, on generals and strategies, on the drama of specific engagements. This is important history, but it's incomplete. The reason the Allies won isn't primarily because they were better generals or better soldiers, although many were. The reason the Allies won is because they had a manufacturing system that could sustain massive military operations indefinitely. Germany had a manufacturing system that couldn't. An American division in 1944 could sustain operations at a distance of 300 kilometers or more from supply bases. A German division couldn't, because horses couldn't make that journey, and back in time frames that permitted sustained operations. An American division could be supplied with ammunition at rates that allowed sustained combat. A German division was sometimes constrained by ammunition supply not because factories weren't producing ammunition, but because trucks and horses couldn't move enough ammunition fast enough. This isn't just about logistics. This is about fundamental military capability. The ability to sustain supply lines at distance is a military capability as important as combat capability. This is what separated the Allies from the Axis. Not superior soldiers, not superior commanders, but superior manufacturing capability and logistical systems that manufacturing capability enabled. The GMC CCKW truck is a physical embodiment of this principle. It's not the most elegant truck ever made. It's not the most sophisticated. It's not the most refined. But it could be produced in the quantities necessary to sustain modern industrial warfare. And in the end, that mattered more than anything else. Let me talk about the specific operational impact of these logistical differences. Consider the Battle of France in 1944. After D-Day, the Allies faced the challenge of breaking out of the Normandy beachhead and advancing into France. This required moving supplies over longer and longer distances as forces advanced inland. The Red Ball Express was the solution. It moved supplies from Normandy ports into France at an unprecedented scale. At its peak, the Red Ball Express involved 6,000 trucks moving continuously, day and night moving over 12,000 tons of supplies per day. This operation was possible because America had produced trucks in massive quantities. It was possible because American trucks had standardized parts and could be maintained in field conditions. It was possible because American factories could continue producing replacement trucks at rates that exceeded wear-out rates. Germany couldn't replicate this. German factories couldn't produce trucks in the necessary quantities. German logistics remained dependent on horses. German forces advanced into France, but they were continuously hampered by supply constraints. This constrained German strategy. They couldn't conduct operations at the scale and tempo that they might have wished. They had to stay closer to their supply bases. They had to plan operations around the logistics that were possible, not the logistics they might have preferred. As Allied forces advanced farther into France, the logistical advantage of American trucks became more pronounced. German forces fell back not just because they were losing combat engagements, but because their logistics couldn't sustain operations as far from supply bases as American logistics could. This same dynamic played out in the Pacific theater as well. American logistics was based on trucks and ships. American forces could sustain operations at enormous distances from the United States because American manufacturing could produce the ships and trucks necessary to move supplies. Japan, by contrast, couldn't. Japanese logistics was constrained by manufacturing capacity. Japanese forces, after achieving rapid conquests in 1941 and 1942, found themselves unable to sustain those conquered territories because manufacturing capacity for ships and supply vehicles was limited. In the Pacific War, American logistics proved even more decisive than in the European War. American forces could establish bases on islands thousands of miles from America, resupply them indefinitely, and operate from those bases. Japanese forces, lacking similar logistical capability, gradually found themselves isolated and overwhelmed. This is what industrial warfare actually means. It's not just about producing weapons. It's about producing the entire logistical system that sustains military operations. The trucks, the ships, the ammunition, the fuel, the food, the equipment, everything. America proved superior at this, not because American equipment was always superior in individual terms, but because American manufacturing could produce everything in the quantities necessary to sustain global military operations indefinitely. Germany couldn't. The Soviet Union eventually could. But by the time Soviet manufacturing reached full capacity, Germany was already defeated. Let me talk about what this means for how we should understand World War II. The dramatic narrative is about specific battles. The Battle of Stalingrad, the Battle of Midway, the Battle of Britain, D-Day. These are important. But they're the visible surface of a deeper struggle. That deeper struggle was about manufacturing capacity, about the ability to produce the equipment necessary to sustain military operations, about logistical systems that could move that equipment to where it needed to be. In this deeper struggle, there was no drama. There were no heroic moments, just factories producing trucks, ships, ammunition, and all the other material necessary for war. American factories producing more of everything than German factories could produce. The Allies won this competition decisively. By 1944, American manufacturing was producing military equipment at rates that had never been achieved before. Over 2 million trucks, over 300,000 aircraft, over 100,000 tanks, hundreds of billions of rounds of ammunition. Germany couldn't match this. Germany could produce excellent equipment, but not in the quantities necessary to compete with American and Soviet production combined. This is the fundamental lesson of World War II. Not that courage or determination or strategy is irrelevant. These things matter, but they matter within constraints established by manufacturing capacity. You can be the best general in history, but if you don't have the trucks to move supplies and the tanks to conduct operations and the aircraft to control the skies, you can't win. America understood this. American military planners understood that manufacturing capacity was as important as military strategy. That's why America devoted such enormous resources to manufacturing. That's why American strategy emphasized using manufacturing superiority to sustain operations, even if they were tactically less efficient than alternatives. Germany understood this eventually, but by then it was too late. Germany was already losing the manufacturing competition. By the time Germany recognized what was happening, the momentum was irreversible. The GMC CCKW truck didn't win World War II by itself, but it's a symbol of the manufacturing philosophy that did win the war. A philosophy that emphasized producing adequate equipment in overwhelming quantities rather than producing perfect equipment in limited quantities. This philosophy proved superior for industrial warfare. It might not be superior for peacetime manufacturing, but for war it was unbeatable. That's the lesson that German manufacturers learned after the war. That's the lesson that remains relevant today. In competition, where quantity and sustainability matter more than individual quality, the approach that emphasizes production volume and logistical capability will prevail. The GMC CCKW truck represents the victory of this philosophy. Not a victory of engineering excellence, but a victory of manufacturing systems and logistical thinking that proved superior to the alternatives. That's why this truck matters historically, not because it was particularly impressive as an individual vehicle, but because it represented a manufacturing philosophy that was capable of sustaining military operations indefinitely. And in the end, that capability was more important than anything else. Let me provide more specific details about manufacturing processes to illustrate why American production was so much higher than German production. The GMC CCKW was designed using what's called the standardization principle. This meant that the same bolt sizes, the same nut sizes, the same fasteners appeared throughout the vehicle. A mechanic needed only a limited set of tools to maintain the entire fleet. This standardization had enormous production implications. A factory producing GMC trucks could source fasteners from multiple suppliers. If one supplier fell behind, another could cover. If one supplier's fasteners were defective, alternatives were available. This redundancy in the supply chain meant that production wasn't dependent on any single supplier for critical components. German trucks used different fastening standards in different locations, different bolt sizes, different nut configurations. This required mechanics to carry a wider variety of tools. But more importantly for production, it meant that German factories needed multiple supply chains for fasteners. When one supplier couldn't keep up with production demands, the entire production could be constrained. Consider the engine. The GMC CCKW used a 6-cylinder engine that was based on a commercial truck engine. The tooling to manufacture this engine already existed. Factories that had been producing commercial engines could shift to military production with minimal retooling. The engine design used off-the-shelf manufacturing processes. Components were simple enough that they could be produced by factories without sophisticated equipment. The Opel Blitz engine, by contrast, was a more sophisticated design. It required more precise manufacturing. It required specialized tooling. German factories had to invest in new manufacturing equipment. German machine tool production couldn't keep pace with demand for these specialized tools. This dynamic applied across the entire vehicle. Every component of the GMC was designed to be producible using existing manufacturing processes. Every component of the Opel Blitz required more sophisticated manufacturing. Let me talk about the impact this had on production scheduling and efficiency. An American factory producing GMC trucks could run its assembly lines at high speeds. Workers performed the same tasks repeatedly. Quality control could be relatively simple because workers had extensive practice. If a production line was producing 500 trucks per day, workers had become expert at the specific tasks required for their station. German factories couldn't achieve the same throughput. German production emphasized quality at every stage. More inspection, more individual attention to each vehicle, more checking and rechecking. This produced higher quality vehicles. but it meant that production rates were lower. Over a decade of peacetime production, this difference might not matter much. A country producing 10,000 excellent trucks per year and a country producing 50,000 adequate trucks per year might both be satisfied with their production. The first country has better vehicles. The second country has more vehicles, but in wartime, the context changes completely. In 1944, Germany needed trucks desperately. They needed them to supply armies in multiple theaters. They needed them to replace losses. They needed them to expand their logistics capacity. Germany couldn't increase production rapidly because doing so would have required massive retooling of factories. It would have required redesigning vehicles for simpler production. It would have required training workers in assembly line techniques that German manufacturing had never emphasized. By the time Germany recognized this problem, it was too late. American production had already established overwhelming superiority. Let me talk about what these production numbers meant in operational terms. In 1944, an American division advancing into France required approximately 300 trucks per day just for supply operations. This meant food, ammunition, fuel, and other consumables. The Red Ball Express and other supply operations had to move 300 trucks worth of supplies per division per day. With 40 American divisions in the European theater, that's 12,000 truck movements per day just to keep the division supplied. This doesn't account for all the other truck movements. Replacements for damaged trucks, movement of artillery, movement of ammunition from depots to combat zones, evacuation of wounded. American factories were producing approximately 50,000 trucks per month during 1944. Some of these went to other theaters, some went to Allies, but many were available for European operations. This production rate meant that the Allies could sustain enormous logistical operations indefinitely. Germany couldn't match this. Germany was producing approximately 2,000 trucks per month during 1944. At that rate of production, replacing worn-out vehicles and combat losses while expanding operations wasn't possible. The math was simple and brutal. America could produce 25 times as many trucks as Germany. With that production advantage, American forces would eventually overwhelm German forces through sheer logistical capacity, if nothing else. Let me talk about what this meant for the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front was the largest land war in history. At its peak, millions of soldiers were engaged in combat across a front stretching thousands of kilometers. The logistical demands were staggering. Germany, despite having invented blitzkrieg tactics and despite having highly trained soldiers, couldn't sustain operations at the scale that the Soviet Union and ultimately the Allies could sustain. Germany used horses for most of its logistics. Approximately 3/4 of all German supply movements used horses. On the Eastern Front, in the Russian winters, horses died by the hundreds of thousands, frozen to death, starved, exhausted. The Soviet Union, despite lacking the manufacturing capacity of America, recognized early in the war that trucks were essential. Soviet factories produced trucks. But, more importantly, the Soviet Union received trucks from America through Lend-Lease. American trucks arrived in the Soviet Union by the thousands. These trucks supplied Soviet armies. German supply lines dependent on horses froze. Soviet supply lines using American trucks continued operating. This wasn't the only reason for German defeat. Soviet courage and sacrifice mattered enormously. Soviet generals made excellent strategic decisions. But logistics mattered too. American trucks enabled Soviet operations in winter conditions that would have been impossible using horses. American trucks enabled Soviet advances at distances and speeds that German logistics couldn't match. Let me talk about specific numbers of trucks provided to the Soviet Union. Through Lend-Lease, the United States provided approximately 400,000 trucks to the Soviet Union during the war. These included GMC CCKW trucks, Dodge trucks, Studebaker trucks, and others. These trucks were produced in America and shipped to the Soviet Union. The sheer number is staggering. The Soviet Union received more American trucks than Germany produced trucks of all types during the entire war. These trucks formed the backbone of Soviet logistics. Without them, Soviet operations would have been significantly constrained. With them, Soviet forces could sustain advances at scales that would have been impossible otherwise. This is what American industrial capacity meant. It wasn't just supplying American forces. It was supplying British forces. It was supplying Soviet forces. It was sustaining a global war effort. Germany, by contrast, was only supplying its own forces, and even that proved beyond its manufacturing capacity. Let me talk about amphibious operations and how logistics enabled them. The Normandy invasion required the movement of millions of soldiers and enormous quantities of equipment across the English Channel. This was logistically complex. Soldiers and equipment had to be transported on ships. Once ashore, they had to be supplied across the beach and then across French territory. The beach operations required specially designed equipment. But once inland, the operations required trucks, enormous numbers of trucks, trucks to move ammunition, trucks to move fuel, trucks to move food, trucks to move engineer equipment, trucks to carry supplies forward as armies advanced. The Red Ball Express, as mentioned earlier, moved supplies at unprecedented scales. But this required having enough trucks. American factories had produced enough trucks for this operation. Germany couldn't conduct amphibious operations at this scale because Germany lacked the manufacturing capacity. For the trucks needed to supply such an operation, this is one reason why the Allies could conduct amphibious assaults on fortified coastlines and sustain those operations indefinitely. Not just because they had brave soldiers, but because they had the logistical capacity to sustain such operations. Germany, lacking this capacity, was forced to defend against amphibious assaults using fixed fortifications. Once those fortifications were broken, Germany didn't have the logistics to mount counterattacks and recover the initiative. Let me talk about what modern militaries learned from World War II. After the war, military planners from all nations studied the lessons of World War II. One clear lesson was that logistics determines military capability. You can have the best soldiers in the world, but if you don't have the supplies to sustain them, you're going to lose. Modern militaries incorporated this lesson. American military doctrine emphasizes logistics. American military strategy assumes vast logistical support. American military procurement prioritizes standardization and interoperability so that logistics is simpler. NATO doctrine incorporates these lessons. NATO forces emphasize logistics. NATO. Standardization agreements ensure that trucks and equipment from different nations are compatible. This wasn't obvious before World War II. German military doctrine emphasized maneuver and tactical superiority. German strategy assumed that superior tactics and superior soldiers could overcome logistical disadvantages. This assumption proved incorrect. The lesson for modern militaries is clear. Logistics isn't secondary to combat operations. Logistics is fundamental to military capability. A military that excels at logistics but has average soldiers and equipment will defeat a military that has superior soldiers and equipment but poor logistics. This doesn't mean that soldiers and equipment don't matter. They do. But they matter within the constraints established by logistics. Let me talk about what this means for understanding modern military competition. In recent decades, militaries have invested heavily in advanced technology, stealth aircraft, advanced missiles, sophisticated communication systems. These technologies are impressive. They're militarily significant, but they don't change the fundamental principle. A military needs logistics to sustain operations. A military that can move supplies more efficiently will have advantages. A military that can sustain operations over longer distances will have advantages. A military that can replace damaged equipment faster will have advantages. This is why modern militaries maintain vast supply chains. This is why military logistics receives enormous investment. This is why military planners obsess over supply line security. World War II established this principle definitively. American logistics defeated German logistics. American trucks defeated German horses. American manufacturing defeated German precision engineering. The most sophisticated German weapons couldn't overcome logistical disadvantages. This is the ultimate lesson of the GMC CCKW truck. Not that it was a particularly impressive truck, but that manufacturing capacity and logistical efficiency matter more than individual equipment quality in sustained military competition. A GMC CCKW truck is available in museums and in private collections. When people look at one, they often think about what a simple vehicle it is. Crude compared to modern trucks, basic compared to sophisticated military equipment. But that simplicity was its genius. Simplicity meant it could be mass-produced. Mass production meant overwhelming numbers were available. Overwhelming numbers meant that logistical operations could be sustained at scales that overwhelmed the enemy. This is the history of World War II when viewed through the lens of logistics. Not a history of brilliant generals and heroic soldiers, although those things mattered, but a history of manufacturing capacity, of industrial philosophy, of logistical systems that proved superior to alternatives. The Allies won because they had manufacturing capacity. The Soviet Union ultimately prevailed in the East because American manufacturing supplied them with trucks. Germany lost because it couldn't match the manufacturing capacity arrayed against it. This is an uncomfortable truth for those who prefer narratives emphasizing heroism and individual excellence. But it's the truth supported by historical records and logistical analysis. World War II was won in factories as much as it was won on battlefields. The GMC CCKW truck is a symbol of that victory. It's not the most impressive symbol, but it might be the most important one, because ultimate military victory doesn't go to the nation with the best weapons. It goes to the nation that can produce enough adequate weapons to sustain operations indefinitely while the enemy can't. That's the lesson of World War II. That's the lesson the GMC CCKW truck teaches. And that's a lesson that remains relevant today. Let me provide more depth on how manufacturing philosophy translated into specific operational advantages. Consider what happened during the winter of 1944-1945 on the Eastern Front. German forces were attempting to hold positions in Eastern Europe. Soviet forces were advancing relentlessly. The conditions were brutal. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Snow fell in massive accumulations. Roads turned into impassable mud. German logistics relied on horses. Horses froze to death. A German soldier later recalled that in January 1945, his unit lost over 300 horses to cold in a single week. These weren't combat losses. These were animals that simply couldn't survive the conditions. Without these horses, supplies couldn't be moved. Without supplies, the army couldn't operate. Soviet forces equipped with American trucks faced different constraints. The GMC trucks could operate in winter. They required maintenance. They required fuel. But they didn't freeze to death. Soviet supply lines using American trucks remained operational when German supply lines dependent on horses were collapsing. This wasn't just about survival. It was about capability. Soviet forces could maintain supply lines across distances of 300 kilometers or more. German forces were limited to distances where horse transport could reach and return in manageable timeframes. In winter, this meant supply lines of perhaps 50 kilometers became extremely difficult to maintain. The strategic implication was enormous. Soviet forces could sustain offensives over longer distances. Soviet forces could maintain operations at higher intensity. Soviet forces gradually pushed German forces backward across vast distances. German forces fell back not just because they lost battles, but because their logistics couldn't sustain operations at the distances and intensities required to maintain defensive lines. Let me talk about the Pacific Theater and how logistics determined the outcome. There as well, the Pacific War was primarily a naval and logistical war. It wasn't decided by individual ship battles or aircraft engagements, although these mattered. It was decided by logistics. Japan conquered enormous territories in 1941 and 1942. Japan took the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, Burma, and many island territories. But Japan couldn't sustain these conquests because Japan lacked the logistical capacity. Japanese logistics depended on ships. Japan needed ships to move supplies from Japan to garrisons across the Pacific. Japan needed ships to move supplies between islands. But American submarines and aircraft attacked these supply ships. Japanese ship losses mounted. Japanese couldn't replace them fast enough. American logistics also depended on ships. But America had vastly more ships. America was producing Liberty ships at enormous rates. America was producing troop ships and cargo ships. American Navy ships, merchant marine ships. Thousands of ships. American submarines attacked Japanese supply ships. Japanese couldn't replace them. American supply ships were attacked. America could and did replace them. Over time, the logistical balance shifted decisively in America's favor. American forces could establish bases on islands thousands of miles from America, resupply them indefinitely, and operate from those bases. Japanese forces, losing supply ships and unable to replace them, gradually found themselves isolated. The island-hopping campaign that characterized American strategy in the Pacific wasn't primarily about conquest. It was about establishing logistics bases from which to sustain operations farther west. Each island base increased the range from which American forces could operate. This strategy wouldn't have been possible without the logistical capacity to sustain it. America needed enough trucks to supply bases. America needed enough ships to resupply bases thousands of miles away. America needed enough aircraft to provide cover and support for operations. Japan couldn't match this logistical capacity. Japan couldn't produce ships fast enough to match American losses. Japan couldn't produce trucks to equip island garrisons. Japan lacked the manufacturing capacity to sustain the logistical competition. By 1944, American forces controlled the Central Pacific and were preparing to advance toward Japan itself. Japanese forces, cut off from supplies, were starving and running out of ammunition. The war was being decided not by individual battles but by logistics. Let me talk about the specific mathematics of supply requirements. An American division in combat required approximately 300 trucks per day just for basic supply operations. This included food, ammunition, fuel, and other consumables. With 40 divisions in France in 1944, that's 12,000 trucks per day just for basic supply needs. But there were additional supply requirements. Ammunition for artillery required additional trucks. Fuel for tanks required additional trucks. Construction equipment required additional trucks. Replacement vehicles needed to be moved forward. Wounded needed to be evacuated. Total truck requirements were enormous. The Red Ball Express, at its peak, moved 6,000 trucks per day in dedicated supply convoys. Additional trucks were operated by individual divisions. Additional trucks were in rear areas. Total American truck availability in the European theater in 1944 exceeded 20,000 vehicles American. Factories were producing approximately 50,000 trucks per month during this period. Some went to other theaters. Some went to allies, but sufficient numbers were available to support European operations, while also maintaining truck supplies in other theaters. Germany couldn't match these numbers. German production of 2,000 trucks per month couldn't replace losses, expand operations, and maintain existing operations simultaneously. Germany had to choose: maintain existing operations or expand. Germany couldn't do both. The mathematics was simple and brutal. American production capacity exceeded German production capacity by a factor of 25 to 1. With that disparity, German defeat was inevitable unless Germany could win through speed and tactical surprise. Germany didn't win quickly. As the war became prolonged, American logistics advantage became decisive. Let me talk about what manufacturing efficiency actually means in practical terms. The GMC CCKW was designed so that components could be mass-produced. The body was stamped steel panels welded together. Any factory with stamping equipment and welding capability could produce body panels. The frame was simple channel steel welded together. Any structural steel shop could produce frames. The engine was based on a commercial truck engine. Commercial engine plants could shift to military production. The transmission was based on a commercial design. The axles were commercial designs. Most of the components were either commercial products or minimal modifications of commercial products. This meant that GMC truck production could be distributed across multiple factories. GMC factories could produce trucks, but so could other manufacturers. Dodge factories could produce trucks using similar principles. Studebaker could produce trucks. International Harvester could produce trucks. Chevrolet could produce trucks. Because the designs were standardized and used commercial components, different manufacturers could produce vehicles that were largely compatible. A mechanic trained on a GMC could work on a Dodge. Spare parts from one manufacturer could sometimes be used on vehicles from another manufacturer. This distributed production meant that no single factory bottleneck could limit overall truck production. If GMC production fell behind, other manufacturers could increase their production. If suppliers couldn't keep up with demand, multiple suppliers could provide components. German truck production was more centralized. Opel was the primary German truck manufacturer. Opel factories produced most German trucks. When Opel faced production constraints, there were limited alternatives. German truck design was more specialized. It was harder for other manufacturers to shift to truck production. As the war progressed and bombing increased, this became critical. Allied bombing targeted factories. GMC factories were bombed. But truck production continued at other factories. Dodge produced trucks. Studebaker produced trucks. International Harvester produced trucks. Multiple factories working in parallel meant that bombing of one factory didn't end truck production. Opel factories were bombed. Opel production fell dramatically. German alternatives were limited. German truck production couldn't recover. This is what manufacturing efficiency and distribution actually means. Not just producing more trucks per factory, but having the capacity to shift production between factories. Having standardized designs that multiple manufacturers could produce. Having supply chains robust enough that disruption to one supplier didn't halt production. Let me talk about what happened to logistical doctrine after the war. Military. Planners from all nations studied World War II logistics. One clear finding was that logistics had been decisive. Nations that could sustain supply lines indefinitely defeated nations that couldn't. Modern military doctrine emphasizes logistics as central to military capability. American military doctrine assumes that forces will be sustained by enormous logistical support. American military procurement prioritizes standardization so that logistics is simplified. NATO doctrine incorporates lessons from World War II. NATO standardization. Agreements ensure that equipment from different nations can use compatible parts and supplies. NATO forces emphasize supply line security and redundancy. Modern militaries maintain strategic reserves of equipment, not because they'll use it all immediately, but because maintaining inventory allows operations to continue even if production is disrupted. This principle comes from World War II experience. Modern militaries emphasize distributed supply operations, not all supplies concentrated in one location, but supplies distributed across multiple locations. This provides resilience. If one supply depot is destroyed, others continue operations. These principles, developed from World War II experience, have shaped military organization for decades. Let me talk about Germany's manufacturing approach and what it means. German manufacturing philosophy in the 1930s and 1940s emphasized precision and quality. German products were known for excellence. German engineering was respected worldwide, but this approach had limitations for wartime production. German designs were complex. They required skilled workers. They required specialized tools. They required precision manufacturing. As war production scaled up, these limitations became apparent. German factories needed more workers. German technical education couldn't produce enough precision workers. Unskilled workers couldn't be quickly trained to manufacture complex precision products. American approaches were different. American designs were simpler. They could be manufactured by less skilled workers. Assembly line techniques could be taught quickly. Production could scale rapidly. German manufacturers after the war recognized this. German post-war manufacturers integrated American manufacturing principles. They maintained German precision engineering, but they adopted American mass production techniques. Modern German vehicles combine both philosophies. Precision engineering designed for efficient mass production. This combination has made German automotive manufacturing one of the most successful in the world. But this synthesis happened after the war. During the war, Germany was still operating according to older manufacturing principles. By the time Germany recognized what was happening, the war was lost. Let me talk about the specific impact of logistics on decision-making. Military commanders make decisions based on what's operationally possible. A commander with abundant logistical support can plan operations that a commander with limited logistics cannot. An American commander in 1944, knowing that truck supply was adequate, could plan operations that moved forces hundreds of kilometers inland. German commanders couldn't plan similar operations because logistics wouldn't support them. An American commander could plan offensives that sustained high operational tempos because logistics could sustain the required supply rates. German commanders had to plan offensives that moved more slowly because logistics couldn't sustain higher tempos. This affected strategy. American commanders could plan aggressive offensives that pushed enemies back continuously. German commanders had to plan more defensive operations or offensives of limited scope and duration. The logistics tale didn't just support operations. Logistics shaped what operations were possible. This is what logisticians mean when they say that logistics determines what's operationally feasible. In World War II, American logistics made aggressive, far-reaching operations feasible. German logistics constrained German operations to limited scope and distance. This difference, compounded over years of war, determined the outcome. Let me talk about specific numbers for Lend-Lease supplies to the Soviet Union. Through Lend-Lease, America sent approximately 400,000 trucks to the Soviet Union. These trucks included GMC CCKW trucks, Dodge trucks, Studebaker trucks, and others. They were produced in America and shipped across the Arctic to Soviet ports. These trucks represented approximately 20% of Soviet truck availability. The remaining 80% was produced by Soviet factories. But those American trucks were distributed strategically to supply operations. They formed the backbone of Soviet logistics during critical operations. American trucks were used to supply Soviet forces during the final offensives that drove German forces out of the Soviet Union and into Eastern Europe. Without these American trucks, Soviet supply lines would have been more constrained. Soviet offensives would have been limited to shorter distances or lower intensities. The strategic implication is clear. American manufacturing capacity wasn't just supplying American forces, it was supplying Soviet forces. It was multiplying Soviet military capability. Germany, facing both American and Soviet forces with their own production supplemented by American trucks and equipment, was fighting against combined production capacity it couldn't match. This was an enormous advantage for the Allies, but it required American manufacturing to produce not just for American forces, but for Allied forces as well. American production capacity was large enough to do both. Let me talk about how logistics affected the timeline of the war. The war lasted 6 years from 1939 to 1945. Germany hoped to win quickly. Germany assumed that superior tactics and superior soldiers could win before American industrial capacity could be fully mobilized. This assumption was incorrect. American industrial capacity was mobilized rapidly after 1941, By 1943, American production was exceeding German production by enormous margins. By 1944, American forces were receiving material at rates that allowed unprecedented military operations. Germany, facing this production advantage, couldn't win. Germany lacked the logistics to sustain a long war against opponents with greater manufacturing capacity. This became clear to German military leadership eventually. But by the time they understood the situation, the war was already lost. Germany couldn't shift to American manufacturing principles quickly enough to change the outcome. The timeline of the war was determined partly by logistics. Germany needed to win before American industrial capacity overwhelmed German production. Germany didn't win in time. American industrial capacity gradually shifted the balance. By 1944, the balance had shifted decisively. This is the ultimate lesson of World War II logistics. Industrial capacity determines long-term military outcomes. Superior tactics can provide short-term advantages. Superior soldiers matter, but superior industrial capacity, over time, determines who wins. The GMC CCKW truck is a symbol of this principle. It's not the most impressive truck. It's not the most sophisticated. But it represents an industrial philosophy that could produce hundreds of thousands of adequate trucks. And that capacity, more than anything else, determined the outcome of World War II. Let me discuss one more critical aspect of logistics: the ability to sustain operations after equipment damage and loss. In combat, equipment gets damaged. Tanks get knocked out. Trucks get destroyed. Aircraft are shot down. Every military organization faces equipment losses. The question is, how quickly can losses be replaced? American logistical advantage included not just production capacity, but also the ability to rapidly deploy replacement equipment. An American tank division that lost tanks in combat could receive replacement tanks within weeks. The division's logistics operations would move damaged tanks to repair depots. Undamaged tanks would arrive from rear areas to replace destroyed tanks. Within a relatively short time, the division would return to combat strength. A German tank division faced different constraints. German replacement tanks took longer to arrive. German tank production was lower. Repair depots were often far from combat zones because German logistics were constrained. This wasn't just about tanks. It applied to every type of equipment: trucks, aircraft, artillery, small arms. American forces could replace losses faster than German forces could. This created a cumulative advantage. American forces could sustain casualties and losses and still maintain combat effectiveness. German forces, facing similar casualties and losses, declined in effectiveness over time because they couldn't replace losses as quickly. Over years of war, this cumulative disadvantage wore German forces down. German forces fought desperately. German soldiers remained brave and committed, but they were fighting with increasingly worn equipment and couldn't receive replacements fast enough to maintain effectiveness. This is a less visible but ultimately more important aspect of logistical superiority. Not just moving supplies forward, but replacing damaged and lost equipment faster than enemies can. Let me discuss manufacturing capacity growth during the war. American manufacturing didn't remain constant. It grew dramatically during the war. In 1941, American war production was just beginning. In 1942, production increased. In 1943, production was enormous. In 1944, production was at peak levels. American factories shifted production from civilian goods to military goods. Automobile. Factories that had been producing civilian cars shifted to producing military trucks and vehicles. Factories that produced commercial equipment shifted to producing military equipment. This wasn't done overnight, but American industrial base was flexible enough to shift at large scales. Factory retooling, while expensive, was manageable. Workers trained to produce civilian goods could be retrained to produce military goods. German industrial base faced similar shifts but had less flexibility. German factories had been shifting to military production gradually since the late 1930s. By the time the war started, much of German industrial capacity was already devoted to military production. This meant that Germany couldn't increase production by shifting civilian factories to military production as the war went on. Germany was already near maximum military production by 1939. Germany couldn't expand military production by huge factors the way America could. As the war progressed, American production increased. German production, already near maximum, couldn't increase much. The gap widened as the war went on. By 1944, American production was at its peak. German production, due to bombing and resource constraints, was actually declining. The production gap, which had favored America in 1943, became overwhelming by 1944. Let me talk about what this meant for replacement rates and sustainability. An American division losing vehicles in combat could receive replacement vehicles within months. Losses could be sustained at rates that allowed the division to remain effective indefinitely. A German division losing vehicles couldn't replace them as quickly. After years of war, German divisions were operating with less equipment than they started with. They couldn't get back to full strength because production couldn't match losses. This is sustainability, the ability to sustain operations indefinitely despite losses and damage. American logistical system was sustainable. German logistical system was not. By 1944, it had become clear that Germany couldn't sustain its military operations. Germany was losing equipment faster than it could replace it. Germany was losing territory. Germany couldn't recover. For German soldiers, this meant that the war was unwinnable. No matter how brave they were, no matter how skilled, they couldn't overcome the logistical disadvantage arrayed against them. For German leadership, this meant that continuing the war was futile. But continuing the war is what happened. The war continued for over a year after it had become clear Germany couldn't win. This prolonged agony for Germany was partly due to German reluctance to surrender, but it was also because Germany had already committed so much to the war that surrendering seemed impossible even after victory was clearly impossible. Let me talk about the human cost of logistical failure. In the Eastern Front, German logistics failed progressively in winter 1944-1945. Supplies couldn't reach German soldiers. Food supplies ran out. Ammunition supplies ran out. Medical supplies ran out. German soldiers froze to death not primarily in combat, but because their units lacked adequate supply of warm clothing. German soldiers died from wounds that could have been treated if adequate medical supplies had been available. This wasn't a failure of individual courage. It was a failure of logistics. German soldiers were brave. German soldiers were committed. But they couldn't overcome the logistical failure that meant supplies couldn't reach them. Soviet soldiers, supplied by American trucks, faced different conditions. Soviet soldiers received supplies. They received food. They received ammunition. They received medical care. Soviet logistical system, supported by American trucks, sustained operations. The human cost of logistical difference was enormous. Tens of thousands of German soldiers died not in combat but from logistics failures. Tens of thousands more became prisoners of war when their units ran out of supplies. This is the ultimate consequence of logistical failure. Not just military defeat, but loss of life that could have been prevented if logistics had been adequate. For the GMC truck, this means that it wasn't just a vehicle. It was a contributor to sustaining human lives. American trucks meant that soldiers received supplies, received food, received medical care, received ammunition. German soldiers without adequate trucks lacked these things. The difference was life and death. Let me provide a final summary of the logistical reality of World War II. World War II was decided in factories and supply depots as much as it was decided on battlefields. The nation that could produce the most equipment and deliver it reliably to where it was needed would prevail. America produced more equipment than Germany. America distributed equipment more efficiently. America sustained operations over longer distances and at higher intensities. Germany produced adequate equipment, but not in quantities sufficient to compete with America. Germany's logistics relied on horses at a time when modern warfare demanded trucks. Germany's manufacturing philosophy prioritized quality over quantity at a time when quantity was more important than quality. The GMC CCKW truck represents American logistical philosophy, simple enough to be mass-produced, rugged enough to sustain abuse, maintainable by ordinary soldiers, available in overwhelming quantities. The Opel Blitz represents German manufacturing philosophy, excellent engineering, precision manufacturing, but limited production and insufficient quantities. One philosophy proved superior for industrial warfare. The other became a symbol of industrial inadequacy. This is the history of World War II when viewed through the lens of logistics. It's not a history of brilliant generals or heroic soldiers alone. It's a history of manufacturing capacity and logistical systems that sustained military operations. American manufacturing and logistics won World War II. German soldiers fought bravely. German generals were capable, but German logistics couldn't sustain a war against an opponent with vastly superior manufacturing and logistical capacity. This is the ultimate lesson. Superior industrial capacity, sustained over years of war, determines victory. Tactics matter. Strategy matters. Soldiers matter. But ultimately, the nation with superior manufacturing capacity that can convert that capacity into logistics systems that sustain operations indefinitely will prevail. The GMC CCKW truck, in all its apparent simplicity, represents this reality. It's a reminder that in modern warfare, quantity has a quality all its own, and that adequate equipment produced in overwhelming quantities defeats excellent equipment produced in insufficient quantities. That's why the GMC CCKW matters historically, not because it was a particularly impressive truck, but because it represents the manufacturing philosophy that won World War II.